I want to continue the conversation with Dan Tannebaum, PwC principal and a global sanctions leader. Dan, we're becoming numb to this, aren't we?
We are. I mean, every week there is some new announcement. Now, this one was well known that the U.S. was planning to withhold expanding the waiver program for an additional 6 months. But the market isn't reacting like you'd necessarily expect, given how regularly the Trump administration is using the sanctions mechanism as a foreign policy strategy, not a tool of foreign policy.
So we've seen the effort, the objective to get Iranian crude exports down to zero before. Does it work this time around?
I don't think they're going to get them to zero, but you are already seeing a number of countries begin to look for additional suppliers. Now, 3 of the countries, Greece, Taiwan, and Italy, had already suspended trading in Iranian oil. But just an hour ago, you see Turkey come out saying, we need more time, we can't find an alternative supplier, basically signaling that they will continue to trade in Iranian oil.
What do you think the response from the State Department will be?
It's unclear. I mean, there's been so much unpredictability in how the U.S. has handled this. I mean, one thing that's obvious, enforcement is much higher in 2019 than it was in 2018. Discrete actions against smaller companies, even some of the large-scale banking actions we've seen. The enforcement threat is there. It's very important to note, though, that historically, sanctions were driven out of the Treasury Department, and as you've been watching, sanctions are now driven out of the State Department, which has no enforcement mechanism. So you're seeing a bit of a power struggle in Washington right now, whereas the balance of power is shifting from Treasury to State, even though the enforcement mechanism still resides at Treasury.
When you speak to clients at the moment, does the advice differ for whether they're based in the United States or Europe at the moment?
It should, but it doesn't. The U.S. has granted itself very significant authority to levy penalties against those found to be trading with enemies, such as Iran, enemies deemed by the United States. For global companies that have any degree of U.S. exposure, the high watermark for a fine is $9 billion. You just can't afford to potentially gamble with such a broad enforcement mechanism. So whether a client is a U.S.-based or a foreign-based client, anyone with any degree of U.S. exposure, the advice is generally the same of basically beware of how much counterparty risk you have to countries like Iran.
There were a group of people that cautioned the State Department and this administration about their embrace of sanctions, the overuse perhaps of sanctions, and perhaps that the more you use them, the more the effectiveness of them diminishes. Is that actually happening? Do you see that actually happening?
Well, the naysayers have left the government, so we're left with people that really are embracing the use of sanctions, not as a tool of foreign policy, but as the strategy itself, which is generally not how they were intended. Historically, sanctions were a longer-term play. Now they're being used like an economic missile to drive near-term reaction, which you are seeing because the force is significant. If you cut a country out from dealings in the U.S. or threaten to enforce fines against foreign companies that deal in the U.S. and that deal with a country like Iran, you're going to see an immediate impact. As it relates to how you manage allied relationships on a go-forward basis, for global companies, this becomes really complicated, particularly with some conflict of law issues that loom.
Well, the Europeans were trying to circumvent some of this. Are they doing enough? Have they done enough? Can they do anything?
So that circumvention play was kind of focused more specifically on humanitarian aid, which U.S. law still technically permits. Now, that being said, the special purpose vehicle hasn't really gotten off the ground and isn't actively trading, but the mechanism was established. There is still that fear of retaliation through enforcement or even tweet of what this could mean for those found to be kind of participating in a mechanism deemed as circumvention, even though under U.S. law it still would technically be permissible.
There's always a sense of who's next, what's next. Do you have a decent sense of that now?
I mean, you wouldn't have called last summer that Turkey could have been next, given some of the acts that were happening there for the pastor held under house arrest. I think it's impossible to predict what's going to happen next. What was safe to say is that the use of sanctions in its current form is definitely here to stay. This administration really enjoys the power that they have globally of getting attention. That being said, allies can't afford to stand up against the U.S. on these issues, unfortunately, for what that could mean to their businesses that operate in the U.S.
Are you busier than before, Dan?
I'm more stressed than I am before. I mean, the issues still remain. A lot of the cases related to sanctions enforcement can take upwards of 7-8 years to actually settle. What I'm more busier in doing is trying to answer questions like what happens next or what does this mean? or how serious is the U.S. for enforcement-related risk. But I really do think the market is somewhat numb to these issues at this point. And for most companies, issues like Iran, most global companies had already backed out of that business quite a long time ago for fear of U.S. enforcement. For any new target, people do take seriously any even threat of U.S. sanctions, like we're now seeing with the Muslim Brotherhood, where they could potentially be designated as a terrorist organization, putting them in the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda.